The old farmhouse groaned in the midnight wind as Ethan said, "It's just the wind, nothing more." But his heart pounded louder than the rattling shutters. The silence pressed in, then a sound shattered it. A single knock at the door, sharp and deliberate. His wife Laura whispered, "Don't open it." Their daughter, Emily, clung to Laura's sleeve, trembling. The second knock came, heavier this time, echoing through the narrow hallway. Ethan's breath caught as the air turned bitterly cold. He whispered, "Someone knows we're here." Laura's eyes darted toward the door, wide with dread. Outside, the night was thick with shadows that seemed to shift on their own. The third knock came, slower, dragging, as if from something that wanted to be let in. Laura said, "Ethan, don't move." The whisper of a man's voice drifted through the wood, hoarse, deliberate, calling Ethan's name. The next morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Laura said, "It wasn't real, Ethan, just the wind." But Ethan's hands shook as he stirred his coffee. Emily sat silently, staring at the window, her small voice breaking the silence. Emily said, "I saw someone outside." Ethan's stomach twisted at her words. Laura forced a shaky laugh, insisting, "It was just your imagination." But Ethan noticed scratches on the doorframe that hadn't been there before. The marks were deep, jagged, as though carved by something desperate to get in. The sun streamed through the window, but even daylight felt wrong, heavy, carrying the memory of the night's knocks. That night returned with unease, every sound amplified by the silence. Ethan sat awake, waiting, his hand gripping a flashlight. Laura said, "Please, come to bed." But he couldn't move, knowing something would come again. Emily slept uneasily, murmuring as if dreaming of shadows. The farmhouse walls seemed to breathe, contracting with the cold. Then, a single knock echoed again, slower this time, almost patient. Ethan whispered, "It knows we're here." The air grew colder, and the clock ticked louder than his heartbeat. The second night's knock came earlier, as if it had grown impatient. Laura covered Emily's ears while Ethan moved closer to the door. Laura said, "Don't let it in." But the whisper came again, louder now, rasping Ethan's name. The sound of something dragging across the porch made Ethan shiver. He pressed his ear to the wood and froze as a faint, wet breathing seeped through. His eyes widened as the whisper hissed, "Open." By the third night, Ethan no longer tried to deny it. The knocking came exactly at midnight. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the door, the rhythm steady and slow. Laura whispered, "If you open it, we're lost." Emily whimpered, her face buried in Laura's shoulder. The door trembled with each knock, dust falling from the frame. Then came silence, broken only by a whisper so faint it seemed to crawl through the wood. Ethan's name, drawn out, deliberate, unholy. The following evening arrived with tension stitched into every breath. Ethan sat rigid in the hallway, a baseball bat across his knees, while Laura whispered, "This isn't living anymore." Emily clutched her toy rabbit, her eyes never leaving the door. The first knock came at midnight, deliberate, steady, and louder than before. Ethan's knuckles whitened around the bat. Laura's voice cracked as she said, "It won't stop until it gets in." Emily whimpered softly, and the sound seemed to draw another knock, harder this time. The air felt thick, the house itself groaning with the pressure. Ethan muttered, "If it wants me, it already knows." The next morning, sunlight spilled weakly through the cracked window, offering no comfort. Ethan traced the scratches on the doorframe, deeper now, fresh splinters curled outward. Laura said, "It's stronger each night." Emily sat quietly at the table, drawing a stick figure beside a dark shape. Ethan asked gently, "What's that?" Emily looked up with wide eyes and whispered, "The man who calls your name." The room fell silent, heavy with dread. Laura clutched Emily's drawing, her hands trembling as the paper shook like a warning. By the third night of knocking, Ethan refused to leave the hallway. Laura begged, "You're breaking apart, Ethan." But his eyes were fixed on the door, unblinking. Emily cried softly in her bed, clutching her rabbit. At midnight, the knocking began again, slower, almost mocking. Ethan whispered, "It's waiting for me." The sound of footsteps dragged across the porch, each step deliberate, until they stopped right at the door. Then silence. Laura covered her mouth, holding back a scream. Ethan leaned closer, every nerve in his body on edge, the silence heavier than the knocks. At dawn, Ethan stumbled outside, determined to prove it was human. The porch boards groaned under his boots. Laura called after him, "Don't go out there!" But Ethan pressed forward. He froze when he saw long drag marks across the porch, gouges as if something heavy had been pulled in circles. Emily stood in the doorway behind Laura, whispering, "It's playing with us." Ethan's breath fogged in the morning chill, though the air was warm. He muttered, "It's not leaving." The marks ended abruptly at the threshold, right where he stood. That night, the knocking came earlier than ever, as if it grew impatient. Ethan raised the bat, whispering, "If it wants me, let it try." Laura pulled Emily back, whispering prayers under her breath. The knocks became pounding, shaking dust from the ceiling, rattling every window. Emily cried, "Please make it stop." But the pounding stopped suddenly, replaced by a whisper through the cracks of the door, the voice clear, hoarse, and deliberate, calling Ethan's name again. Ethan's bat slipped slightly in his sweaty hands. Laura whispered, "It knows you're listening." The morning carried an unnatural stillness, as if the world waited for something unseen. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his eyes tracing the drag marks again. A voice startled him, smooth yet unsettling. The neighbor, Richard, stood at the edge of the yard, smiling too wide. Richard said, "Strange nights lately, aren't they?" Ethan froze, his mouth dry. Laura appeared behind him, pulling Emily closer. Laura said, "Why are you here so early?" Richard's grin lingered, and his eyes shifted toward the door, as though he already knew what lay beyond. Ethan's grip tightened on the porch railing. Richard walked closer, his boots crunching on gravel, his smile never faltering. Ethan asked, "Did you hear it too?" Richard tilted his head, voice low, "I hear many things, especially when the wind talks." Laura shivered, pulling Emily back into the house. Richard's eyes lingered on the doorframe where the scratches had deepened. He brushed a hand across the wood, whispering, "This old house lets everything in eventually." Ethan's chest tightened as he muttered, "Stay away from my family." Richard's grin widened as though he had been waiting to hear those words. Later that evening, Ethan sat at the table staring at his untouched meal. Laura whispered, "Richard knows something." Emily traced circles on her plate, her voice barely audible. Emily said, "He's the man I drew." Ethan's hand slammed the table, the sound echoing through the kitchen. Laura's eyes welled as she whispered, "We need to leave." But Ethan's jaw locked and he said, "Running won't stop it." Outside, the wind howled as if mocking their fear. The clock ticked toward midnight again, each second stretching longer than the last. At midnight, the knocking returned, heavier than before. Ethan stood ready with the bat, but Richard's voice called from the porch. Richard said, "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" Laura gasped, holding Emily tighter. Ethan shouted, "Leave now!" But Richard's voice was calm, smooth, almost taunting. Richard whispered, "You opened the door the first night when you listened. Now it knows your name." The knocks grew violent, rattling the frame, while Richard's laughter bled into the sound of wood splintering. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving only silence. Ethan pressed against the door, listening. Richard's voice whispered, "It doesn't knock for me anymore. It knocks for you." Ethan's blood ran cold as he heard footsteps fading into the night, leaving the house trembling in quiet dread. Laura whispered, "What does he mean?" Ethan's hands shook as he whispered, "We're not dealing with him. We're dealing with something else." Emily buried her face into Laura's chest, whispering, "He's feeding it." The house groaned as if it had heard her. The storm rolled in with a sky bruised purple and gray, lightning slashing across the horizon. Ethan spotted a figure standing by the old fence line, cloaked in shadows despite the flashes. Laura whispered, "Who's out there?" Emily clung to her arm, trembling. Ethan stepped forward, voice low, "Stay inside." The figure didn't move until Ethan reached the porch. Then the man's voice rasped through the rain, "You hear it, don't you?" Ethan's chest tightened, his knuckles whitening around the bat. Laura's voice cracked as she said, "Ethan, come back." The stranger raised a hand, his eyes gleaming in the storm's light. The stranger stepped closer, boots sinking into the mud. His voice was rough, deliberate. The stranger said, "It knocks because you heard it. It will keep calling until the door is open." Ethan demanded, "Who are you?" The stranger's smile was grim. "Someone who survived long enough to warn you." Laura pulled Emily tighter against her, whispering prayers. Ethan felt the weight of his words settle like stones in his chest. The stranger leaned closer, water dripping from his coat, and whispered, "It doesn't want the house. It wants a name." Inside, the storm rattled the windows as the stranger stepped into the dim hallway. "Ah," Laura hissed, "he shouldn't be here." Emily hid behind her mother's legs, staring at the stranger with wide eyes. Ethan asked, "What do you mean by a name?" The stranger's eyes locked on him, unblinking. "It's not wood it knocks on, it's memory. Once you hear it, it owns a piece of you." The words hung heavy, each one a nail hammered into their fear. Laura's hands shook as she whispered, "Then how do we stop it?" The stranger only sighed, "You don't." The stranger placed his hand against the scratched doorframe, his fingers lingering on the jagged grooves. He whispered, "These marks aren't warnings. They're invitations." Ethan's stomach turned, and Laura pulled Emily further back. Emily whispered, "He smells like the knocking man." The stranger turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable. Ethan stepped between them, his voice sharp, "Stay away from my daughter." The stranger tilted his head and said, "It already chose her when she drew him." Silence swallowed the room, broken only by thunder. Thunder cracked as the stranger stepped back toward the door. He whispered, "It will come again tonight, louder, closer. When the time comes, do not open it, no matter what voice you hear." Laura whispered, "Why help us?" The stranger's eyes clouded with sorrow as he answered, "Because once, no one helped me." His gaze lingered on Emily before he turned, disappearing into the storm. Ethan stood frozen, heart hammering, as the house creaked and the rain poured harder. Laura clutched Emily, whispering, "We're trapped." Ethan whispered back, "No, we're being hunted." The storm eased by morning, but tension hung like smoke. Ethan paced the kitchen, muttering, "He knew too much." Laura tried to steady her voice, "The stranger only warned us." Emily sat at the table, her eyes red from crying. Suddenly, a knock came at the back door. It was Richard, smiling calmly as though nothing had ever happened. Richard said, "I thought I'd check on my neighbors." Ethan's jaw tightened. Laura forced a nod, whispering to Emily, "Stay near me." Richard's eyes flicked to the scratches as if admiring them, his grin never faltering. Richard stepped inside uninvited, brushing mud from his boots onto the worn rug. Ethan barked, "Get out!" But Richard only laughed softly. He said, "Why fight it, Ethan? You already let it in." Laura pulled Emily closer, trembling. Richard leaned against the wall, his eyes gleaming. "You think I survived this long by resisting?" Ethan's stomach sank. Laura whispered, "You've been feeding it." Richard's grin widened. "It knocks because I taught it where to go." Ethan's grip on the bat tightened, rage and terror colliding. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper, each word dripping with venom. "It doesn't just knock for anyone. It needs fear, and you've given it plenty." Emily whimpered, pressing her face against Laura's side. Ethan shouted, "You brought this here." Richard laughed, low and hollow. "No, Ethan, it was already here. I just showed it where to find you." Laura's face drained of color, her arms tightening around Emily. The house groaned, the walls vibrating as though stirred by his words. The air grew colder, and Richard's smile widened, enjoying their terror. As thunder rumbled outside, Richard stepped closer to Ethan, his eyes wild. Richard said, "If you want to save them, give it what it wants." Ethan spat, "Over my dead body." Richard grinned, leaning close enough for Ethan to smell the damp rot clinging to him. Laura cried out, "Stop this." Emily sobbed quietly, whispering, "He's lying." Richard's grin faded briefly as if her words stung. He snarled, "Children should learn to be quiet." Ethan raised the bat, his rage breaking through his fear. The lights flickered violently, plunging the house into near darkness. Richard's voice dropped to a hiss, "You'll open it, Ethan. Sooner or later, everyone does." A violent knock thundered against the front door, shaking the walls. Emily screamed, "Don't let him!" Laura held her tighter, whispering prayers. Ethan stood frozen, the bat slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. Richard laughed as the knocking grew into a furious pounding, dust falling from the ceiling. He whispered, "It's hungry, and you're the feast." Ethan's heart pounded as the house trembled under the unholy rhythm. The pounding shook the walls until the frames cracked. Dust rained from the ceiling as Ethan shouted, "It won't stop!" Laura clutched Emily, sobbing, "Don't open it." Richard laughed darkly in the corner. "You'll give in," he hissed. Emily's cries grew louder, the knocking syncing with her sobs. Ethan's chest tightened as the doorframe splintered, pieces breaking free. Laura screamed, "Please, Ethan." But Ethan whispered, "It already knows my name." His hand trembled as he reached toward the latch, sweat dripping onto the floorboards. The door groaned as Ethan's hand rested on the handle. Richard's voice slithered, "Do it, Ethan. End the waiting." Laura cried out, "Don't you dare!" Emily buried her face in Laura's chest, whispering, "It's outside." The house seemed to breathe, the air heavy with decay. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, muttering, "If it wants me, it will take me." Thunder split the sky, shaking the house. Laura screamed louder, but Ethan twisted the latch. The knock stopped instantly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the pounding. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed through the house. Cold air swept inside, carrying the metallic scent of blood. Ethan froze, staring at the emptiness beyond. Richard's grin spread wider, his eyes shining. "It's here," he whispered. Laura sobbed, pulling Emily back into the corner. Outside, the porch groaned under invisible weight. Ethan whispered, "I can't see it." A faint, rasping breath filled the doorway, followed by a whisper that dragged his name across the wood. Emily screamed, "Shut it!" But Ethan couldn't move. The whisper grew louder, layered with countless voices. Richard shouted triumphantly, "It knows you now." Ethan staggered as the air pulled at him like unseen hands. Laura cried out, "Fight it!" Emily's voice cracked, "Daddy, don't go!" Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing the door closed, but it resisted as if something pressed back. The wood bowed, the hinges screeching. Richard's laughter echoed, feeding the chaos. Ethan roared, shoving with all his strength as the voices screamed through the crack. With a final scream, Ethan slammed the door shut, the latch snapping into place. The pounding stopped. Silence fell heavy, broken only by Ethan's ragged breathing. Laura sobbed, holding Emily tightly. Richard's grin twisted into fury. He spat, "You've only delayed it. It will come again." Ethan collapsed to his knees, whispering, "Then we'll be ready." But outside, in the silence, came a sound that froze them all. A slow, deliberate knock, louder than before, echoing through the farmhouse walls. The house fell into silence, broken only by the faint creak of wood settling. Ethan pressed his back against the trembling door, whispering, "It's not gone." Laura cradled Emily, whispering prayers under her breath. Richard stood smirking, his eyes glinting with triumph. He said, "Once it knows your name, it never forgets." Ethan's head hung low, sweat dripping as he muttered, "Then it's not finished with us." Emily clutched her toy rabbit tighter, her small voice trembling. "It's still outside." Thunder rumbled in the distance, but the knock did not return, yet. Later that night, Ethan sat at the table, his hands shaking as he stared at a candle's flame. Laura whispered, "We can't survive another night." Emily clutched her rabbit, staring at the door in silence. Richard leaned casually in the shadows, his voice calm. "The only way to stop it is to give it what it wants." Ethan snapped, "And what is that?" Richard's grin widened, his eyes fixed on Emily. Laura gasped, pulling Emily close. Ethan roared, "You stay away from her." The candle flickered violently, as if responding to the fury filling the room. The silence shattered when a new knock boomed through the house, louder than any before. The floor vibrated, the glass in the windows rattling. Laura screamed, "It's coming through." Emily sobbed, burying her face in her mother's chest. Ethan stood, gripping the bat so tightly his knuckles turned white. Richard's laughter filled the room, echoing through the pounding. "You can't stop it," he hissed. The knocking grew faster, a rhythm like a heartbeat, shaking the walls as dust fell in streams. Ethan shouted, "Then I'll face it," and turned toward the door. Ethan pulled the door open in a single motion, roaring against the storm of sound. The hallway was flooded with icy wind, extinguishing the lights. Darkness stretched into the house like living smoke. Laura screamed, "No!" Emily wailed, her rabbit falling from her hands. Richard's laughter broke into silence as he was dragged toward the door, his nails clawing against the floorboards. Richard screamed, "It wants you, not me!" Ethan's eyes widened in horror as a massive shadow swept past him into the house. The shadow consumed the hallway, swallowing Richard's screams until only silence remained. Ethan slammed the door shut, but the house no longer felt theirs. Laura sobbed, holding Emily close, whispering, "It took him." Ethan stood frozen, whispering, "No, it took us all." Emily looked up with tear-streaked cheeks, her voice shaking. "It's inside now." A soft knock echoed not from the door, but from the walls within the house. The sound spread slowly, rhythmically, until every room pulsed with it. The family was no longer waiting. It was already here.